In 1459, in the frozen mountains of the Carpathians, a silent march climbed through the Argesh River Valley. They were not soldiers. They were not pilgrims. They were the condemned. 300 men walked in chains, wearing the remains of silks and velvets that once symbolized power. Their hands, accustomed to holding golden chalices and sealed documents, now bled under the weight of iron chains. Ahead of them, knights bearing the emblem of the Black Dragon commanded the march in complete silence. The sky was gray as lead. Fog descended from the mountains like a funeral veil, and at the top of the valley, among sharp rocks and cliffs that defied the heavens, the ruins of an ancient fortress waited. That fortress had no name. For centuries it had been abandoned. Its walls crumbled, its towers were broken in half, the wood of the doors had rotted. Time devoured it, stone by stone, as if the earth itself wanted to forget it. But Vlad Drăculea, Prince of Wallachia, would not allow oblivion to win. He needed that fortress. Not just erected, rebuilt, transformed. And the men who marched in chains were the only ones capable of doing it. Because they were boyars, nobles, traitors, survivors of the Easter massacre. 3 days earlier, 500 of them had been impaled on the hills of Targoviste. Their families watched. Their screams echoed for hours. Blood stained the earth. But 300 were spared, not out of mercy, out of utility. Vlad watched them now from atop his black horse. There was no anger in his face, no satisfaction, only a coldness that froze more than the mountain wind. "Here," he said, pointing to the ruins, "you will build my fortress, stone by stone, until the last tower is raised, or until the last of you falls dead." None of them dared to respond. They knew there was no choice. They knew that from that moment forward, they would cease to be men. They would be merely tools, flesh and bone in service of an iron will. And as the chains were removed and the first stones began to be lifted, a question hung in the frozen air. Why had Vlad chosen precisely that fortress? Why there, at the most unreachable point in Wallachia? What did he fear so much that he needed walls built with the sweat and blood of his own nobles? The fortress was called Poenari, or rather what remained of it. Built in the 13th century by a distant ancestor, it had served as an outpost against Mongol invaders. Then it was forgotten, abandoned, devoured by time and the elements. But Vlad knew its history. He knew that those walls, even in ruins, had resisted sieges. He knew that the location, atop a cliff 1,200 steps above the Argesh Valley, made any attack nearly impossible. And he knew, above all, that whoever controlled that fortress controlled the main escape route between Wallachia and Transylvania. And he needed an escape route, because war was coming. Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who commanded the largest army in the world, would not forgive what Vlad had done: the massacre of Turkish emissaries, the refusal to pay tribute, the murder of thousands of Ottoman subjects along the Danube. Mehmed would come. And when he came, he would bring fire and blood. Poenari would be the last line of defense, the final refuge, the place where Vlad could resist until allies came, if they would come at all, the place where he could disappear into the mountains if everything else failed. But building a fortress in the heights of the Carpathians was no simple task. It required thousands of stones, tons of wood, months of continuous work, and Vlad did not have months. He had no money to hire masons, no time to wait. So he used the boyars. 300 traitorous nobles who had conspired against his father, who had supported usurpers, who had sold Wallachia to the Turks and Hungarians as if it were cattle at market. Now they would pay, not with the quick death of the stake, but with something worse: forced labor until the end of their strength. In the first days, the boyars still behaved like nobles. They complained, demanded clean water, asked for rest. Some tried to negotiate. They offered gold, lands, eternal loyalty. Vlad did not respond. He only watched. And when someone refused to work, one of the dragon guards pushed him off the cliff. The body disappeared into the valley below. No scream, no funeral, only the cold wind carrying the distant sound of bones breaking against the rocks. After the third body, no one complained anymore. The work began at dawn, before the sun even rose. The boyars descended the cliff carrying ropes, pickaxes, and empty baskets. In the valley, on the banks of the Argesh River, they extracted stones from ancient quarries. Enormous stones, heavy. Some required 5 men to be moved. Then they climbed 1,200 steps, carrying the stones on their backs, or on their shoulders, or in baskets tied to their chests, step by step, without stopping, without rest, under the scorching summer sun or the cutting snow of approaching winter. The dragon guards carried nothing. They only watched and counted. Each stone had to reach the top. Whoever dropped one was whipped. Whoever tried to escape was impaled in front of the others. At night, the boyars slept on the stone floor, wrapped in rags. They ate thin gruel and hard bread. They drank water from the river that descended frozen from the mountains. There was no fire, no shelter, only the open sky and the cold that penetrated their bones. And Vlad watched everything. From his tent, erected at a safe distance, he followed every movement, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. He needed that fortress to be ready before winter, before Mehmed sent his legions, before it was too late. But there was something more, something the boyars did not understand, something that Hungarian and Saxon chroniclers years later would try to explain and fail. Vlad was not just building a fortress, he was building a symbol, a message, for the Turks, for the Hungarians, for anyone who dared to challenge him. The message was simple. Here rules a man who does not negotiate, who does not forgive, who transforms traitors into tools and raises empires on the bones of his enemies. But the question remained, how many would survive until the end? And more importantly, what would Vlad do with those who survived? The first weeks were the worst. The boyars, accustomed to a life of luxury, were not prepared for brutal work. Their hands filled with blisters that burst and bled. Their backs ached under the weight of the stones. Their feet swelled and cracked on the rough steps. Some collapsed in the middle of the climb. They simply stopped moving, sat on the steps, staring into the void, waiting for death. The guards did not force them to continue. They simply pushed them off the cliff. Others tried to escape. They waited for nightfall, when vigilance decreased, and slid down the side rocks. Few reached the valley. Most fell and died before reaching the river. Those who succeeded were hunted by Vlad's war dogs, brought back and impaled before everyone. But some resisted. Younger men, stronger, or simply more obstinate. They understood that the only chance of survival was to obey, work, endure, and wait. Among them was a boyar named Stro. He had been one of the richest in Wallachia. He owned lands that extended through 3 valleys. He had 15 servants, 3 wives, and a fortune in gold accumulated over decades of trade with Venetians and Genoese. Now Stro carried stones like a slave. His silk clothes had turned into rags. His beard, once trimmed by barbers, was dirty with earth and blood. His hands, which signed contracts and held chalices, now trembled with exhaustion. But Stro did not give up, because he had a son, a 12-year-old boy who had been spared from the Easter massacre. Vlad kept him hostage in Târgoviște, and Stro knew that if he died there, the boy would die too. So he worked, day after day, stone after stone, step after step. And at night, when the other boyars groaned in pain or cried silently, Stro whispered prayers, not to God, but to his son, promising that he would survive, that he would return, that one day somehow there would be justice. But as the weeks turned into months, a terrible truth began to reveal itself. Vlad never intended to free any of them. The construction of Poenari was not just a work, it was a slow execution, a punishment that extended in time, breaking men not only physically, but spiritually. And when the first tower was raised, and the boyars looked up expecting some recognition, some word of relief, Vlad simply pointed to the second ruined tower. "Continue," he said. In the 3rd month, the first men began to die not from falls or executions, but from exhaustion. Their bodies simply stopped functioning. The heart gave out. The lungs collapsed. Or, in some cases, the mind shattered before the body. A boyar named Radu, not Vlad's brother, but a common man who shared the name, simply began to laugh. In the middle of the climb, carrying an enormous stone, he began to laugh, a loud, uncontrolled, almost hysterical laugh. The other boyars looked frightened. The guards approached, confused, and Radu continued laughing as he released the stone, which rolled down steps and nearly hit another worker. "It's all a joke," Radu shouted between laughs. "Don't you see? We're building our own prison. We're raising the walls that will keep us trapped forever." One of the guards tried to silence him, but Radu dodged and ran toward the edge of the cliff. For a moment it seemed he would jump, but then he stopped. He turned to the other boyars, and with tears streaming down his face, still laughing, he said, "He's not going to kill us. He's going to turn us into stones. We'll become part of this fortress. Our bones will be the foundations, our blood the mortar, and when he leaves, we will remain here, forever, imprisoned." The guards grabbed him before he could say more. They dragged him away. No one knows exactly what happened to Radu. Some say he was impaled, others that he was thrown into the river. But there is a third version, darker, more disturbing. They say Vlad kept him alive, chained in one of the newly built towers, as a reminder, as a warning, so that the other boyars would see what happens when the mind breaks before the body. And as construction advanced, slowly, painfully, a new question began to haunt the survivors. How much longer would this last? When would the fortress be complete? And most importantly, what would Vlad do with them when he no longer needed their hands? The answer would come, but not in the way they expected. In the 5th month, only 140 boyars remained alive. More than half had died. Some fell from the cliff. Others were executed for disobedience, but most simply collapsed under the weight of work. Their bodies were thrown into the valley, where crows and wolves took care of the remains. The survivors were specters. Their faces, once proud, were sunken and pale. Their clothes, completely destroyed, were replaced by animal skins that guards occasionally threw. Their voices had disappeared. They no longer spoke. They only worked in silence, like automatons. But the fortress grew. The first tower was complete. The outer walls began to take shape. The foundations of the second tower were being raised, and for the first time, Vlad seemed satisfied. He climbed to the construction site every morning. He walked among the boyars, observing each stone placed, each wall raised. He did not speak to them. He did not recognize them as human beings. He only inspected, as a master inspects tools. But there was something different in those days. Vlad spent long hours alone at the top of the newly built tower, looking toward the horizon, to the south, to the Danube, to the Turkish lands beyond the border. The guards whispered among themselves. News arrived from Târgoviște. Ottoman emissaries had been seen at the borders. Sultan Mehmed was gathering an immense army, 60,000 men, perhaps more. And the destination of this army was clear: crush Vlad Drăculea and transform Wallachia into a Turkish province. The fortress of Poenari was not being built just as a symbol of power. It was a last refuge, a place where Vlad could resist when everything else failed, a place so inaccessible that not even the largest army in the world could reach it easily. But for it to work, it needed to be complete, and time was running out. Vlad descended from the tower and addressed the guards. "Double the pace," he ordered. "I want the second tower ready in 2 months, and the walls complete before winter." The guards hesitated. "Excellence, the men can barely stand. If we force more, then they will die faster," Vlad interrupted, "and we will use their bones as foundation. Now obey." That night, the boyars worked under torchlight. For the first time there was no rest. Work continued through the dawn, and when the sun rose, many of those still alive wished they were dead. Among them, Stroh, the man who worked thinking of his son. His hands bled so much they left red trails on the stones. His feet were raw flesh, but he continued, because he knew that stopping meant dying, and dying meant condemning his son. But something was changing inside him, a silent rage, a contained fury, against Vlad, against the guards, against God, who allowed this, and against himself, for having been foolish enough to believe that conspiracies and betrayals would bring power. Now he understood. There is no power without consequence. And the consequence of betraying Vlad Drăculea was worse than death. It was becoming part of his legend. The 6th month brought early winter. Snow began to fall in the Carpathian mountains, covering the steppes and making the climb even more treacherous. The boyars slipped constantly. Some fell and broke bones. But there were no doctors, no treatment. Those who were seriously injured were simply left aside until they died. And still, construction continued. It was during this time that historical documents begin to record something extraordinary. Hungarian chronicles, written years later, mention a fortress raised in impossible time. Saxon chronicler Michel Beheim writes about the castle of the condemned. And even Turkish chronicles, though rare, speak of a cursed place where the dead do not rest. But what makes these records even more intriguing is a specific detail that appears in multiple sources: the speed of construction. Medieval castles took years, sometimes decades, to be erected, but Poenari was rebuilt in less than a year. How? The answer lies in Vlad's methods. He did not follow normal construction rules. He did not wait for mortar to dry properly. He did not worry about long-term structural quality. He just wanted walls, fast. And he did not care how many men would die in the process. The boyars worked 16 hours a day, sometimes more. They carried stones in darkness, guided only by the faint light of torches, and when exhaustion knocked them down, guards kicked them until they stood up, or threw them off the cliff. But there was another secret, one that was only revealed centuries later, when archaeologists examined the foundations of Poenari. Among the stones they found human bones, not just a few, dozens of them, skulls, ribs, femurs, mixed with mortar, incorporated into the walls, as if the very bodies of the dead boyars had been used as construction material. Some historians argue this was accidental, that the bodies were simply thrown into the foundations for convenience. But others believe it was intentional, that Vlad, knowing the superstitions of the time, wanted to create the legend that the fortress was literally built with the bones of traitors. And it worked. Poenari became known as the Castle of the Dead, a cursed place. A place where the souls of boyars still wandered, imprisoned in the stones. A place that even Turkish soldiers, years later, would be afraid to attack. But in that winter of 1459, the surviving boyars did not think about legends. They thought only about surviving the next day. And Stroh, the man who worked for his son, was beginning to perceive a terrible truth. Even if he survived, even if construction finished, Vlad would never let him leave. Because he knew too much, had seen too much. And a man like Vlad did not leave living witnesses. The only question was, how would he die? Fast, like those who fell from the cliff, or slow, like those who were impaled? The 7th month marked a change. The outer walls were complete. The second tower was almost ready. And for the first time, Vlad allowed the boyars to rest, one full day, without work, without constant vigilance. The survivors, now only 80 men, could barely believe it. Some cried with relief. Others simply collapsed on the ground and slept for hours on end. And Stroh, the man who carried the weight of his son, finally allowed his hands to stop trembling. But the rest was not an act of mercy. It was strategy. Vlad knew the men were on the verge of total collapse. If he continued forcing, he would lose all workforce before the fortress was completely functional. So he gave them one day, only one, so they could recover enough strength for the final effort. And during that day, something extraordinary happened. A monk appeared. No one knows where he came from. Some say he climbed the 1,200 steps alone, carrying only a staff and a wooden cross. Others claim Vlad sent for him, but most accounts agree on one point. He was there to bless the fortress. The monk was old. His white beard descended to his chest. His clothes were simple, patched, but his eyes had an intensity that made even the guards look away. He walked slowly through the construction site, touching the stones, murmuring prayers in Latin. When he reached the place where bones had been incorporated into the foundations, he stopped. He remained silent for a long moment. Then he turned to Vlad. "This fortress carries blood," he said, "and blood calls blood. What you build here is not just stone. It is a monument to pain, and one day this pain will return." Vlad did not respond. He only observed the monk with that characteristic coldness, and after a long silence he said, "Then let it return, because when it returns, it will find walls that do not fall, and a man who does not bow." The monk slowly shook his head. Then he turned to the surviving boyars. "You," he said, "carry the weight of betrayal, but you also carry the weight of redemption. What you have built here will remain, and with it will remain the memory of what you suffered." Boah! Some of the boyars cried upon hearing those words. It was the first time in months that someone treated them like human beings, like men with souls, and not like disposable tools. But Strode did not cry, because he knew that words would not change anything, that prayers would not bring his son back, and that, regardless of what the monk said, Vlad still decided who lived and who died. When the monk departed, descending the steps slowly, leaning on his staff, the boyars returned to work. And this time, something had changed. They no longer worked only out of fear. They worked with a strange resignation, as if they knew that fortress would be their tomb. And they wanted at least for it to be a worthy tomb. The 8th month brought the end of construction. The second tower was complete. The walls were solid, the gates reinforced with iron, and for the first time Poenari looked like a true fortress, impenetrable, threatening, majestic. Vlad climbed to the highest tower and observed his creation. From the top he could see for kilometers the Argesh Valley, the Carpathian Mountains, the dense forest that extended to Transylvania, and to the south, far beyond the horizon, the Turkish lands from where the storm was approaching. It was ready. When Mehmed came, he would find an enemy that could not be easily crushed, a refuge that would resist sieges, a symbol that Wallachia, even small, did not bow. But one question remained: what to do with the surviving boyars? Of the 300 who began, only 70 remained alive, 70 broken men, exhausted, but still breathing, still conscious, and therefore still dangerous, because they knew. They knew how the fortress was built. They knew how many had died. They knew about the bones in the walls. They knew that Vlad, the Prince of Wallachia, had sacrificed his own nobles to raise that monument. And Vlad could not allow this information to spread. So, the next morning, he gathered the 70 survivors in the central courtyard of the fortress. They knelt, waiting. Some expected freedom, others execution, but all expected an end. Vlad walked among them slowly. He looked at each face. He recognized some. Men who had dined in his palace, who had signed treaties, who had sworn loyalty, and then betrayed. "You have built this fortress," he finally said, "and for that, you earn a choice." The boyars raised their eyes, confused. A choice? Vlad never offered choices. "You can leave," he continued. "You can descend the steps, return to your lands, reunite with your families. But no, if you do, you can never speak about what happened here. If one word about this construction reaches my ears, not only will you die, your families will die, your children, your wives, your servants, all." He paused. Let the silence weigh. "Or," he said, "you can stay. Serve as guards of this fortress, protect it, and in return you will have food, shelter, and the guarantee that your families will remain alive." The boyars looked at each other. It was not a choice. It was a trap. Leaving meant living in constant fear. Staying meant perpetual imprisonment. But in both cases, it meant surviving. Stroh was the first to stand. "I stay," he said. His voice was hoarse, broken. "But I demand to see my son." Vlad observed him for a long moment, then nodded. "It shall be done." One by one, the other boyars made their decisions. 42 chose to stay. 28 chose to leave. And when the gates of Poenari opened for the first time, those 28 descended the steps slowly, like condemned men walking to the gallows. None of them ever spoke about what happened, not because they were afraid of Vlad, but because deep down they knew no one would believe. How to explain that an entire fortress was razed in months, with the hands of traitorous nobles, under the command of a prince who did not distinguish justice from vengeance? It was an impossible story, and therefore it remained silent, hidden, until archaeologists and historians, centuries later, began to discover the truth in the very stones. The fortress of Poenari remains to this day, partially in ruins, but still imposing. Tourists climb the 1,300 steps. 100 more were added over the centuries to see the place where Vlad Drăculea, the impaler, built his last refuge. And when they walk along the walls, touching the ancient stones, few know they are walking over the bones of men who died there, that each block carries a story of pain, exhaustion, and despair, that fortress was not built by hired masons or loyal servants, but by traitorous nobles who paid for their crimes not with quick death, but with months of brutal work. Historical records about Poenari are scarce, but those that exist are consistent. Byzantine chronicler Laonikos Chalkokondyles mentions a fortress razed in impossible time. Saxon chronicler Michel Beheim writes about the castle of the condemned, and Turkish documents, though rare, speak of a cursed place where the dead do not rest. In 1972, during archaeological excavations ordered by the Romanian communist regime, researchers found something disturbing in the foundations of the North Tower, a layer of human bones mixed with mortar. Subsequent analyses confirmed that the bones dated from the 15th century, and that they belonged to multiple individuals, adult men, between 30 and 60 years old, exactly the profile of the boyars who were forced to work there. The discovery was kept secret for years. Nicolae Ceausescu's regime did not want Vlad's history to be tarnished. He was a national hero, a symbol of resistance, and revealing that he had used nobles as slaves and incorporated their bodies into constructions could stain that image. But after the fall of communism, the documents were released. And today, historians from the University of Bucharest and the Institute of Archaeology of Cluj study Poenari, not only as a military structure, but as a monument to the cruelty and determination of a man who refused to bow to empires. And Stroh, the man who worked thinking of his son? Records show he actually reunited with the boy. Vlad kept his word, but Stroh never left Poenari. He served as a fortress guard until he died in 1467 during a minor Turkish attack. His body was buried in the very walls he helped build. Today, when the wind blows through the Carpathians and crosses the ruins of Poenari, some say you can still hear the ghostly footsteps of boyars climbing the steps, carrying stones that no longer exist, building walls that have already crumbled, imprisoned forever in the very work they created. Because Vlad did not just build a fortress, he built a legend, and sometimes legends are more enduring than stone. And if this story was silenced for centuries, buried in archives and hidden in castle foundations, how many other stories still remain hidden? How many secrets has history tried to erase, but which the stones insist on keeping? In the next chapter of Lost Legends, we will dive into The Polish Ambassador, where we will discover how Vlad used psychological terror to negotiate with one of the greatest powers in Eastern Europe. Prepare to learn about the most tense verbal duel in medieval history, because sometimes what seems like legend is just the part of history that has not yet been told.